Have you here. Um, Today's Let's Talk is on unlearning silence and how to speak your mind, unleash your talent, and live a more full life. And I think we all could use some of that, right? So before we start, please introduce yourselves, whether you're watching this via live stream or in the live Zoom audience. Let us know what city you're coming from. And if you want to connect with other folks on LinkedIn, add your LinkedIn profile as well. We're trying to build our community and connections online. So for those who are on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, on live stream, we want you in the conversation as well. So introduce yourselves in the comments or in the chat, wherever you're at. Once again, tell us where you're coming from, and we want you engaged in the conversation as well. So today's Let's Talk, as I mentioned, is on how to unlearn silence. For those who are new to Community of Seven, there is one singular goal of these calls, and it's to create an environment where we can come authentically as we are, where we can have these honest conversations, where we feel accepted, and we are with other purpose-led leaders to talk about what matters most to us. So before I introduce our guests, a little quick, let me see if we can do it right now. On the top right-hand side, for those who are in the live Zoom audience, put this in gallery mode, and turn on your videos if you're comfortable, because we love seeing your beautiful faces. Hi, everyone. So put this in the gallery mode, and I'm going to ask a series of questions. If the answer is yes, raise your both hands like this. And for those who are watching this via the live Zoom, the live stream, in the chat, you can just write yes or no, okay? So first question, how many of you have ever worked in an organization where you didn't feel your voice was heard? Second question, how many of you have left an organization because you felt silenced or not valued at work? I've quit jobs without anything lined up because of toxic situations. Last question, how many of you feel that communication skills is crucial to good leadership? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for your frank answer. Top right-hand side, put this in speaker mode for those who are in the live Zoom audience, so you just see me. Thank you so much for your honesty, and it still gets to me how many people have suffered in silence in corporate America. And that's why I'm so excited to have Elaine here to talk about the impact of silence and the importance of unlearning silence, and how we can start speaking our mind, speaking up, and unleashing our talent, right? And ultimately live our best life, right? So today, during our talk, we're going to really dive deep into this topic and talk about the pervasive influence of silence in our personal lives, but also how we come to work. And we're going to really talk about how we can really dismantle these systems and reclaim our voice at home and at work. So in her book, Elaine really talks and challenges this notion that having a seat at the table doesn't always equate to having a voice that is actually heard. So you might have a seat at the table, but is actually anyone listening to you? So she confronts this hard truth, right? Often speaking up in the office, sometimes even at home, is difficult and discouraged. Particularly, it can be met with resistance, negative consequences, etc. And, while prepping for this talk, I really went back to my journey kind of growing up. And not many people know this, but I was in ESL till I was in about 5th grade. So ESL, for those who in the US, it's English as a second language. Here's the thing. I left Vietnam when I was 8 months as a refugee. So I was literally raised in the US. But I was put in ESL at a very young age, partly because of the way I looked, but partly because I didn't speak up as much, right? Because I was afraid to. I was afraid of the teachers. And it wasn't until I was in the 5th grade when a teacher realized that I didn't need to go through ESL and she put me into a debate team. And she realized that she convinced me to compete in this debate team, and I ended up winning. And that one act of this teacher believing in me, elevating my voice, and saying that you can, I started to speak up more because I was literally in silence from first to fifth grade, so much that people didn't think I actually spoke English. And think about if you are in a culture where you are silenced in corporate America because your voice isn't valued because of the way you look, what title you have, the fact that you have ability, a different ability, socioeconomic classes. There's so many different ways we silence people, right? And so, fast forward to when I was in corporate America, I can vividly remember when a manager told me to not talk during meetings with a client, because he wanted to have that privilege or that right, or he didn't feel I was ready to talk to the client. And I think about the numerous times, and from talking to a lot of you guys, you've also experienced this, where you would actually be the person doing the work, creating the PowerPoint presentation or creating the speech, but you wouldn't be the one to present. You would do that for someone else. You know, I've been told you're not a good public speaker. Now I'm doing it for a living. So, what are the stories that other people are telling us to silence ourselves? And what's worse, what are you believing? Right? So, we're going to unpack a lot of these things, right? Um, and I just want to encourage you guys as we have this conversation to dig deep into the stories that other people have told you, and more importantly, the stories that you're now telling yourself. And if it is not encouraging, if it is not helping you become the person you want to be, I want you to learn to kind of unpack it and maybe throw it away and then start replanting some of these, better stories, these better narratives, right? So we're going to have a lot of invaluable insights today. Okay, so really quick before I introduce Elaine, in the comments or the chat, wherever you're watching this, if you're watching this via live stream, put it in the comments. If you're watching from the live Zoom audience, add it in the comments. And I want you to write maybe kind of just one word, right? And for the people or the leaders that have inspired you, what's the one thing that they did that made you speak up more? So I'll give you the example of Miss Wilson, and she told me that I could, right? And maybe someone elevated you. So in the comments, I want you to press it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and press the comments. They made you feel safe. They supported you, trusted. Sharon, I created space to speak. They empowered you. They mentored me. They listened. They cultivated my gift. They asked me, what do you think about this? Oh, something so simple, right? My mentor and best manager allowed me to present for myself. Oh, these are just giving me goosebumps, guys. Thank you so much for this. Believed wholeheartedly. All we need is that one person. And here's the thing, we can be that one person for someone else, right? For me, it was Miss Wilson just saying, join the debate team. You have a voice, right? Giving out those opportunities. So I'm really excited for this talk today. Thank you once again for everyone sharing this in the live Zoom audience and those on the live stream as well. And as we read this, I hope we can become those people for others, right? So Elaine Lin Hering is a facilitator, an author, and a speaker. She works with organizations and individuals to build communications, collaboration, and conflict management skills. She has worked on 6 continents and facilitated executive education at Harvard, Dartmouth, Tufts, UC Berkeley, and UCLA. She is a former advanced training director for Harvard Mediation Program, and she's a lecturer of law at Harvard Law School. She has worked with coal miners at BHP Billiton to microfinance organizations in East Africa, mental health professionals in China, and senior leadership in the US. In the Department of Commerce, her clients have included, American Express, Chevron, Google, Nike, Novartis, PayPal, Pixar, and the Red Cross. She is currently the author of her Unlearning Silence. I would bring it up, but it's in pre-order right now, even though I've ordered it. How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully. So once again, if you have the time, purchase her book, go to Amazon, and once you get the book, make sure you review it, because that's how we hug our author. So let me bring you on right now. Hi, Elaine. So excited to have you here.
I am so honored to be here. And Lynn, I could not have asked for a more perfect introduction. Can I actually read the opening of my book? Because
Yes,
we're
please.
talking about doing all the work and not getting credit. That is literally where I started. So if you'll indulge me, this is the advanced copy. Everyone knew it was wrong for him to take credit for my work. I was the one who had stayed up late to crunch the numbers. I was the one who had coordinated with the stakeholders. I was the one who had taken and distilled pages of notes into 3 succinct talking points. Everyone knew it had been me. Everyone but the executive who mattered. And yet no one said a word when my colleague took credit, when the executive praised him for his brilliance, when my colleague was given the promotion. I was angry. Angry at him, angry at others, angry at myself. Why hadn't I defended myself? Why hadn't I found a way to take credit? It was my work, all my work. Yet to say something would seem petty. To say something would mean not being a team player. To say something would not really matter. I'll leave it at that for now. But when you describe that, it's such a universal experience that is so incredibly frustrating, that does not honor our contributions and all that we bring. And it happens everywhere. And so as much as I want to see this as jazz hands when you were asking the questions, and jazz hands would be a good thing, it's like, oh, all of us have experienced this in some way. And most of us internalize the challenge the way that everyone else frames the challenge, which is, you're the problem.
Mm,
If you could just speak up more, if you could be more confident, if you could have more courage, then we could promote you. Then
yeah.
we could have you talk with the client. Versus, yes, we've all learned to be silent and at times been rewarded for that. But our managers, our leaders, the systems, the policies all silence us, not always intentionally, right? So this isn't about blame, but let's be real about the real impact it has on us, and the trauma and the work that we have to then undo to then rediscover the reality that we each have a voice. Or Donna, yes, you come across too strong, right? And so it's like, I remember that feedback, Elaine, you're too loud. Okay, so I'm going to tamp myself down. And then wait, but you need to speak up more. And so I'd ramp it up. And it's all this contorting that is exhausting. And then, particularly those of us who carry subordinated identities, whether that is race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., you just can't get it right. And once you do, the target changes anyways.
Yeah.
So
So,
let's answer the question in a more realistic way, which is to say there's this thing called silence. It is pervasive in our lives and in our world. As you said, what have we internalized? What have we begun to believe? What
mhm,
are other people doing that silences us each day? What are the policies and procedures that we need to change so that each of us can actually be who we are, and
yeah,
let that not only be okay, because okay is baseline, but let that be good.
yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that. And I'm just kind of curious for the folks who are kind of on this call in the Zoom audience, or if you're watching this via live stream, I want you to answer in the comment right now. How many of you, and you could just say yes or no, have ever had someone take credit for your work?
Mm.
Yes or no? How many of you have had anyone take credit for your? I'm seeing a lot of yeses right now. It's like literally yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I'm watching on the live stream on LinkedIn and stuff, and it's yes, 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 yes. Sadly, more than not. Um, that's a lot to unpack, right? So this is a common, like, what do you do in these situations? What did you do? And here's the thing. Here's the thing, Elaine. You are an expert at this,
Mm.
facilitating and speaking and negotiation, and you had this
Mhm.
done to you. How can us mere mortals deal with
Well, let
deal
me
with?
recalibrate. I am but a mere mortal as well. And I say that with humility and with hope, because each of us has a contribution to how we are shaping the world around us. Each of us speaking up, maybe for ourselves or maybe for a colleague, maybe for a family member, we fundamentally change the horizon and what is normal. And so I feel like I'm just doing my part. And being mortal, being human, means that I am subject to all of the same systems that we are. A system that in corporate America centers and has been designed for primarily a white cis man with a full-time caregiver and homemaker at home to do all the household administration. The fact that we are still debating whether there's parental leave in the United States structurally silences women. Sociologist Jessica Calarco has this great line of other countries have social networks, support networks. The United States has women.
Mm.
And we are acculturated to do that. Women are supposed to be all these all these shoulds, supposed to be caring, supposed to be self-sacrificial. By the way, don't be too threatening, be likable, be, your competence. And it is all this contortion. And where I go back to is let's diagnose reality more accurately. What are the levers? One lever is the ways I'm silencing myself. So, what messages have I internalized? Did I believe them when they told me that I couldn't speak at the client meeting? Or is that because they fundamentally underestimated me? I will say there are some people in this world who just don't get it. Even former colleagues of mine. I had sold the book. It sold at auction to the largest publisher in the world at a 12 publisher auction. They sold global rights and translations, all that stuff. And an older white man said to me, I guess you might have a special niche audience in Asian Americans.
Mm.
And I went, oh, you don't get it. You don't get that silence is in every family, every household, every community, every team, every workplace. And how would you know if I'm going to be compassionate about it? How would you know if your voice has always been normed? Your voice has always been welcome. But I have an opportunity here, which is to say, the ways that you underestimate me, let's just wait, because I don't have to internalize that message. I don't have to believe that this is just a niche thing for Asian Americans. Does it disproportionately affect Asian Americans? Yes, absolutely. There are cultural things. There is, why are we most represented in entry level, but least likely to be promoted to senior management, right? The statistics speak to all of that as well. But what I can control is how much I internalize that message and what weight and power I let it have in my life versus taking your opinion, it's just your opinion, as truth. And then I have lots of thoughts for leaders of what we need to do differently. Because again, if you have never been silenced, you don't know how deeply painful it is, how exhausting it is, how demeaning it is. And this is where I've worked with so many leaders across industries who are so well-intentioned, right?
Mm.
I want to be inclusive. I want to support my people. Or even from a really pragmatic perspective, capitalist perspective, I want to unleash their talent. I want to get to the best results. I want the best ideas to come forward, not just the loudest ideas. But I don't know how to do that, right? I don't realize that I am silencing the very people I claim to support. Now, I know that because I've been brought in and I have the diagnostic calls with their team members who say, yeah, I would never say that, right? There's no way I would ever say that to Jim. And Jim's like, but I ask them all the time. We have these open surveys. Why are we getting crickets? This is so frustrating. I'm like, oh, there's this disconnect. And the disconnect is from you and your actions and the way that you have designed or not designed work. Silences the very voices that you're claiming you want to hear. And the reason I say design work is because if we're not actively designing our communication patterns, they default to serve and center the people with the most institutional and organizational power right now. So that's why everybody else flies into headquarters so the CEO doesn't have to travel. You're typically doing it, holding that key meeting in a time zone, time of day that works for the highest power people. Often we're saying you have to have a real live conversation, talk in 3 succinct bullet points versus actually typing in Slack could be just as effective. If this is about ideas, how do we design in a way that captures the insights and lowers the barriers to entry for communication? So it's not just the people who are wired and served by those dominant norms, but we can actually, and so to me, it's really low-hanging fruit. Hey, Lan, what makes it easiest for you to share your thoughts? Because I really want to hear them. Oh, you're a post processor and you would rather circle back after a meeting by email? Fantastic. Even better, let me give you the questions ahead of time. That was 20 seconds of a conversation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That fundamentally transforms how you experience work, whether I hear your thoughts, whether we all benefit from your insights. So if your boss, your manager has not initiated that conversation, you also could initiate it or write it, right? Whatever is your preference to say, hey, the way that I communicate or process best is X.
Mhm.
Can we try that for the next week? And I'd say 90% of managers are like, oh my gosh, yes, thank you so much. I had no idea. Of course. Also notice, let's try it for 1 week. It's a small time-bound, low stakes in experiment where you then can get some data. You could troubleshoot and readjust and recalibrate, but let's try something because what we're doing is not working.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating how you were saying that companies are kind of built um, really with this kind of power play, kind of command and control built
Mhm.
into it, right? And even if you look at neurodiversity, right, which is big right now, um, the corporate world was built for
Mhm.
extroverts, right? And so even kind of how seating arrangements are made and open space and how meetings are run, or even when you do kind of all hands things where there's icebreakers or there's things, they're basically created by extroverts.
Yeah,
So,
mandatory extrovert time that
yes.
makes extroverts want to crawl and I really need to go to the bathroom right now. I'll be back
Yeah.
after it's over. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I wonder, there seems to be this kind of correlation in a lot of ways, right? Where the traditional model, it's the folks who are loud, the ones that
Mhm.
are extroverted, who speak up in meetings, you
Mhm.
know, they're the ones that get to present, they're the ones that get the executive training because they're in leadership positions. And so there's only limited resources. So we only get to train these few, right? And so it becomes like this vicious cycle where the folks who are the loudest, the ones that are, extroverted, the ones who are, a little bit more aggressive tends to um, get elevated and promoted. So what's this notion of, I think about being polite, like,
Mhm.
right? And so for someone who says, "Oh, well, Lan, you don't need to speak," and I, you want it like, and I think about your story in the beginning too. You wanted to be polite, so you didn't say anything. Well, I don't
Mhm.
want to make them feel uncomfortable. But
Mhm.
they obviously didn't care about my feelings when they said that, right? So there's this whole notion of like, how important is it to kind of deal with this whole notion of being polite and
Mhm.
agreeable? And I think that there are a lot of men who are agreeable too,
Mhm.
but I think women tend to, we're kind of brought up in a way where we're supposed to be
Yeah.
quiet, especially in certain cultures, right?
Yeah.
A certain way. And how do you
Yes.
kind of break that?
Yeah.
You're programmed from an early age to kind of be this.
Yeah. And for those of us who are like, oh, internalizing that, why am I this way? Why did I internalize it? We're also penalized more for when we don't show up as people expect. So a couple of ideas come to mind. One is this prioritization of extroverts. It is called the Babel hypothesis of leadership for a reason, right? The more that people talk, the more they are perceived to be leaders or have leadership ability. But that is a perception that we can disrupt. And so, in each of our conversations, what are we valuing? Are we valuing airtime, or are we quantity, or are we valuing quality? So, that is something just as we each are listening, what are we internalizing? Then, in terms of being agreeable, because the other need that I hear from leaders is, well, we need people to disagree. We need people to tell us when things are going wrong. We need people to debate, but do that without being disagreeable. To me, the most effective way of doing that is actually sharing the dilemma. And what I mean by that is many of us don't end up sharing our thoughts because, for example, in the example you set up, we don't want to be perceived as impolite or disagreeable or not a team player. And that's actually a negotiation that happens inside our heads, right? I have this idea. I think that Anne is missing something, but I don't want to be perceived not as a team player. And so I essentially silence myself with my own rebuttals in my head before I even say anything. Right. And no one even knows that this is happening. They're just like, oh, she's dead weight in the meeting. Why is she not saying anything? So instead of having that debate in your head, sharing the dilemma out loud. And I think there's something missing here. I worry about sharing it or bringing it because I don't want to slow down our process because I so appreciate all the work that your team has done and don't want to diminish that. At the same time, I'm worried that by the time it gets to the client, it'll be too late to course correct. So in that, I've layered on all the complexity of thoughts because it's not just that I want to correct you. I do also want to value your team. But it's not that I just want to value your team and therefore I'm not going to offer the insight. So that complexity of bridging together our thoughts with and rather than but being the great eraser, once you say it, people can't hear what you said before that. I love you, but can you please pick up your socks? Which part do we actually hear? The second part, bridging things with and or at the same time, or even just a full stop, period, right? But actually sharing more of that dilemma rather than holding it in your head helps people understand, oh, they're human. They want to support me. You're actually bringing the complexity that is just reality into the world rather than letting things be so unidimensional.
I love that. And I want to kind of dig a little bit more into your book.
Mhm.
You kind of shared your story at the very beginning about being silenced, but why this book and why now? What
Mhm.
made you wake up and say, this is the book that I want to create?
Yeah, I have a couple of answers. One is the advice out in the world right now around speaking up essentially boils down to a Nike version of just do it, right? Just speak up as if it is that easy, as if it is not costly. And at some level, it feels misinformed to me. And at the worst, it feels irresponsible because not each of us actually have the privilege in our workplaces and our communities to say what we really think. So I wanted a more nuanced understanding. of what's actually going on here. The others, I spent more than a decade teaching negotiation, difficult conversations, and feedback skills frameworks out of the Harvard Negotiation Project. And while I think the content that my colleagues have created is useful, there would still be people after paying a lot of money for these trainings who wouldn't negotiate, wouldn't have difficult conversations, wouldn't give and receive feedback. So I started to wonder what's missing. And to me, that missing piece is, oh, the silence we have learned, those messages we have internalized over time, and the ways that the people and the systems around us continue to support certain voices and silence others. And so really wanting a more accurate diagnosis and prescription of what's going on here, because change is going to come from me unlearning my silence for sure. Change is also going to require the people around me to read their email, right? And see email as a form of communication that is just as valid as in-person communication. Because my getting on a plane and flying across the country when I've got a 3-month-old child who will not sleep is far more costly than if I am a single person without caregiving duties. And we're not even talking about the sandwich generation here, right? So really wanting to change the narrative. And then the third is I am someone who was born in Taiwan. I immigrated when I was 10 months old, but I come from an Asian culture where respect and deference to your elders means that you stay silent. So I am the youngest daughter of an Asian American family. I am also Christian in faith and been taught to turn the other cheek, right? Be the bigger person. All these messages we get that essentially do not nourish yourself, your needs, do not value who you are, that tell you you're problematic. So I want to change that. I want each of us to be able to live fully. I want belonging, dignity, and justice to be realities and not just aspirations.
Yeah.
And the question I get most is that actually possible? Right? Am I just stuck where I am? If I have been silenced, can I actually change things? And I am living proof that the answer is yes. It is not easy work, but it is necessary work. And people keep asking, why this book? Why now? I think this book should have been out. I started thinking about it in 2015, and letting other people's priorities take precedent over my own priorities meant that we are 9 years later. And right now, particularly with what is going on in Gaza, there's so much conversation about silence, about what people say, don't say, about how it is deafening, about the alienation, about the double pain that comes from not being seen. So I think it is timely because there's never a better time than now
Yeah.
to start living more fully for yourself and also show up more as the leader in your home, in your community, on your team, that you actually, most of us aspire to be and say we want to be, but we're not having that impact yet.
Love that. I just want to read some of the comments before I ask you my next question. Lena, I have learned that being agreeable is not the same as agreeing, and it
Totally.
has been freeing. And we also have another quote from or suggest recommendation from Anne. Insight discovery is a great assessment to take with your team to learn about yourself, perceptions and others, and working styles. And I think that's really key. And I think you kind of hit on that, is that, the structure was kind of built for a certain type of personality and a certain kind of, emotional intelligence, right? And that, we have to advocate for ourselves in a lot of ways, and understanding that it is nuanced, that everyone has a different kind of learning
Yeah.
and speaking style is key. Um,
Let's also pause on that because yes, we should and we can advocate for ourselves. And we are all battling so many things on so many fronts every day. So it really does feel to me like a pick your battle situation of where can you put energy toward today? And this notion that we would have different communication streams and different communication mediums is something anyone
Yeah.
raise in terms of conversation. So in terms of allyship or co-conspiratorship, or how do you build an inclusive work environment, that's something anyone can raise, even if you actually prefer to talk, even if you are an extrovert. You can create more of this space for everyone to be seen, known, heard, valued by initiating that conversation. You don't have to be a parent to advocate for parental leave.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what hit me was when you started kind of giving that the story about, being brought up in an Asian household, and you're taught at a very early age for deference of adults and authority figures.
Mhm.
Well, and
Mhm.
so then you go into corporate America and you are hardwired to listen to adults, listen to authority.
Mhm.
Um, and so when you have that boss that tells you, oh, don't speak up in meetings, or let me present because you're not a good speaker or whatnot. How do we, in your book, Unlearning Silence, you talk about, how we learn silence, right?
Mhm.
How can we unlearn these things? And how does it have an impact on us both personally and professionally? Like, why do we need to deal with it if we want, I guess, success in life and at work?
Yeah. Let's back up and just define a couple of terms. So for me, voice is certainly the words that you use, but voice is also how you move through the world. And so when I talk about using our voice, it's how do I want to show up? Can I have agency? Chapter 3 of my book is When Silence Makes Sense, because I think there's so much shame and guilt and, oh, I should have spoken up. Why didn't I speak up? And then we get in this self-flagellation that serves no one. There are times where silence makes sense. If you cannot afford to lose your job, if you cannot, you're so at the brink of burnout that another thing rocking your world means that you can't actually pick up your kids from school or be functional. There are different seasons in life. So I wouldn't say that unlearning silence means you're always saying everything. Unlearning silence to me is having the agency to decide, when am I sharing who I am, what I think, all these things of how do I move through the world. Um, and why does it matter? Because having to silence yourself, having to edit out parts of yourselves keeps your nervous system on chronic high alert, right? And that leads to all sorts of health issues. It also means that we are often suffering in silence. And there's been lots written about loneliness as an epidemic, having the same health impacts as smoking or obesity and shortening one's lifespan. In the book, I also cite Mario Kart, which is one of my favorite moments, because in Mario Kart, there's a badge called double pain. Whether it is a cancer diagnosis or losing your job or something difficult going on at work, that is the initial pain. But feeling like you can't talk about it with anyone else, feeling like you have to hold that alone, is another level of pain. We may not be able to solve the cancer or get you a job or, change the other person that you're interacting with, but what we can all do for each other is solve the double pain of having to go through it alone. But that requires us to be able to share. That requires other people to be able to hear us and hold space for us. And so unlearning silence is realizing, am I living the way that I want to live? What are my values? For those of us who have long been silenced, there's even this question of, what assumptions do I hold? Do I believe I have a voice? Because I have been valued in my communities and my team for my utility, what I can do, the results I can drive, rather than for my humanity, who I am, what I bring. So the first place I'd start is actually with an internal conversation, which is in every meeting, every moment, asking yourself, what do I think? And what do I need? And those are really simple questions, but they can also be radical if we have never been asked, what do you think? What do you need? Particularly as we're solving for everyone else around us rather than ourselves. And what happens when you start to ask, what do I think? What do I need? Is you realize you do have needs, not because you're a needy person, but because you are human. And what do I think? Oh, I actually do have thoughts of my own that differ from someone else. I'm always a plug for how do we make it easier for people to actually unlearn their silence. So I'm going to add in a bonus here. I think it was Diana earlier who mentioned it was easier to speak up when someone asked me, what do you think? I want to take that to the next level because what do you think in certain contexts, and particularly if there's not a whole lot of trust, can feel like a trap, right? My boss says, Elaine, what do you think? And I'm like, ooh, do you really want to know? What are you going to do if I really tell you? So the move that tends to be even more helpful that anyone can do, instead of asking, what do you think, use standard questions. Like, what about this idea resonates or doesn't resonate? What about this plan works for you, doesn't work for you? So you see that in those questions, you're inherently inviting disagreement and different perspectives, but it's not because someone has to take a big risk. It's just we're training ourselves to say, these are the questions we always ask as a team. What about this works? What about this doesn't work? And so it's less about all this courage and energy and real fear perceived and real risks to sharing a different perspective, and instead just answering the questions that we as a team always answer.
Love that. While you were speaking, there was some really a great conversation coming out in the notes, and I want to read a few of them. Brenda, being raised Christian, there's so much value placed on girls, women being submissive and quiet, such a hard thing to unlearn. Kelly, I believe that it's true, and to a lesser degree for boys as well. Teaching children to be seen and not heard was commonplace in my childhood, right? Um, so I love that whole notion of like giving people the space or the option to disagree, right? So there's been a huge movement, especially in learning and development in corporate landscape of creating psychological safety within companies, right? How does psychological safety and we had Shed Sludletsky come, he wrote a book on speak up culture. And I think there's this whole these conversation really go hand in hand. The ability to not be silenced, but also speak up. Like, how does this kind of relate to psychological safety?
Yeah, you cannot have psychological safety if you are silenced.
Mm,
Right? If you feel silenced, unseen, unheard, unvalued, unwelcome by your manager, by your cross-functional lead, by your spouse, it is not psychologically safe. So psychological safety is the absence of interpersonal fear. Then there is fear because you have received the message that you are not welcome. And therein also lies the opportunity, which is unlearning silence is interrogating, where did that message come from? Where did that perception come from? Is that because every boss I've had in the past treated me that way? Is that actually true of this relationship that I am in right now? Is that history or is that present? I'm not trying to discount history because that would be gaslighting, but to really interrogate what is here and also think about what can other people do to increase the likelihood that I feel safe, I experience that psychological safety. Yeah, there's so much buzz about psychological safety, and the reality is if you are silencing people, you cannot have psychological safety, which is why I put the onus on leaders. And that could be leaders with a capital L with the job title or lowercase l because you are leading, to create that space to really interrogate in what ways might I unintentionally be silencing the very people I claim to support. And chapters 5 and 9 in the book have really outlined ways of we might do that, starting from, do you realize how hard it is to speak up?
mhm.
Because again, if you've never experienced it, you're like, oh, just do it. I was able to do it, but we are differently situated. So can you recognize that?
So let's talk more about that. How can leaders and team members encourage more, especially in environments where silence is maybe the norm. How can
Mhm.
leaders and team members encourage more open and authentic communication?
Yeah, there is definitely the expression of intent, right? What emotional climate are you trying to build? What kind of culture are you trying to build on your team? If you say you want to build an inclusive team, if you say you want collaboration, you got to paint a vision. Absolutely. And your actions have to back it up. So, as you are listening, do you as a leader have the skill set to listen across difference? And by listen across difference, I mean hear differences of perspective, hear through different styles of communication. If someone has too many ums or they start to tear up, do you shut down and do you then diminish what they're saying because it's not how you would have communicated it? Do you change the topic when someone says something? There's this moment that Robert Livingston calls channel surfing. So we're having a conversation. I come to you and say, Lan, there's no way we're going to hit the deadline. And your response is, well, you've got to make it work. It seems like we're both talking about the deadline, but there's actually a subtle shift where you've changed the channel. I came saying we're not going to hit the deadline. You could listen more of, hey, what's going on? What pressures are you under? How can I support you? But you've just said you've got to make it work, which is your opinion, your topic. And then the message I receive in that very short interaction that happens all the time is, oh, it's not safe to talk with Lan about this, right? I experiencing it as being shut down. So leaders, those are a couple off the bat of, can we listen across difference? Can we listen through our biases? Can I stay on the topic you raised rather than changing it to the topic that is front of mind for me?
And so, okay, so I love the whole thing with what we can do as leaders, team leaders, etc. But there's a big swath of us, and I think you mentioned it in the beginning as well. It's easy to advocate for yourself if you are a senior leader, right?
Mm,
But how about those who
easier.
are maybe just starting out or individual contributors? How can they advocate for themselves, but maybe for others as well? Like, how do you kind of advocate for yourself if
Yeah.
you are just starting in your career or,
Yeah.
there's so many, I think, barriers when you're first
Mm-hmm.
starting out.
Mm-hmm. Two thoughts. One is self-advocacy comes from realizing what do I need is the first place. You can't advocate for yourself unless you actually know what you need and what would best serve you. So going back to what do I need, asking that question regularly. And again, it's low stakes because no one has to know you're doing it. It's internal. The second is how do you frame the ask in a way that is of benefit to other people, right? This is what's in it for them. So I need, I have this self-awareness. I'm a post processor, right? Let's use this example. I'm a post processor. If you want to get my best thoughts, you can get them out of me by not ending the conversation in the meeting, but setting up a process where I can come back after I've had time to reflect and offer in my thoughts. So the self-advocacy is a process move to say, here's what's going to best serve me, which by the way, best serves you. So can you link what you need to a benefit for someone else? Tends to work to increase the likelihood that they're going to want to listen to you, want to help you. The how do we advocate for other people is tricky because I've seen really well-intentioned attempts at advocacy that end up making things more confusing. And have a couple of examples in the book. One is if you're going to advocate for someone else, check with them to make sure that your assumptions of what would help are actually right. Hey, Donna, I'm thinking that it would be helpful if I do this. Is that actually hitting the right notes for you? Right? Versus going and changing something that might not actually help them. Or they might say, I just had that conversation with someone else already. It's going to be a little too complicated. Can you hold off? But checking your assumptions before you act. And then the second is being visible. In that so often there is a difference between public support and private support. So you're in a meeting, the senior leader says something disparaging to you. No one else in the meeting actually says something. And then afterwards, everyone's emailing, messaging you, being like, oh my God, are you okay? And it's like, where were you? Why didn't you say something in the moment so that I didn't feel so isolated? So, in that moment, if you notice someone is talking over someone else, hey, I want to go back to what Mo just said, or can you let Mo finish? I want to hear what they were saying because I think it's really valuable. So, it's both the move to disrupt in the moment and also elevate to help with that cognitive awareness of, I want to hear what Mo has to say because I think it's really valuable, or because I think it's a missing perspective. Anything that disrupts that moment and also contextualizes why the other person or the offending person should change their behavior.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of a story that an executive once told me, and she mentioned this whole notion of she had just been starting out, so she had just gotten her MBA, so she was probably the youngest one in this really small meeting with Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of Chase, and
Mhm.
two other white male executives.
Mhm.
And she would try to talk, and she kept on being interrupted by the other two men.
Mhm.
And Jamie Dimon stopped the man and just said, "Let her finish."
Totally.
So it's this whole notion of when we can advocate for other people. There's so much power for that, especially when we do have power, and sometimes
Mhm.
when we don't as
Mhm.
well. I love those examples that you had given.
And
Um,
doing it for each other, right?
yes,
Doing it for each other, because the other piece of this is when we are silenced and exhausted, how do we have time to rest and recover? But if we are each showing up for each other, we get those turns that we get to take.
yeah, I love that. There is a question. Mo, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to ask for you? Want to be respectful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Ryan. That's very kind of you. So basically, I asked the question already in the message. Basically, a situation not just once. So
Mhm.
the leader invited free expressions and feedback out of a good intention to let people speak. And certain members started complaining, and honestly, those point of views are very negative and not really they are true, but there's also good things. It's like a glass of water. Some certain people only look at the empty part, right? But that definitely started spreading that negative energy, and people start thinking, oh, actually that's true. And then I just observed people started supporting this idea, and then the ambience of the meeting became rather negative than uplifting. So the leader was left in actually it was my previous boss. She was left in a situation she's
Mm.
a little bit offended
Yeah.
and felt like I also did a lot for you guys and she didn't feel heard. So it became kind of like a debate at the end, and the people are kind of in denial at the end, and it didn't end very well. So I hope to know if there's another way when we face this situation to moderate it better.
Thank you
It's
so
such
much.
a great question. Thank you, Mo. Two thoughts come to mind. One is what I mentioned earlier about standard questions, right? Instead of asking for open-ended feedback, to say, what has gone well this quarter? What has been frustrating this quarter? So you're and literally spending the same amount of time on each question can get you more of that balanced perspective, because the questions we ask actually really shape the conversation we end up having. But that is what questions are we asking and how are we structuring the meeting? And if you can skew it, not skew it, but what are you teasing out in the moment? Tease out both the positive and the constructive or the negative. That gives you a more balanced perspective. And if you didn't do that ahead of time, there's how do you contextualize the feedback that you're getting, right? I'm hearing a lot of thoughts about what needs to change here. I also want to be sure, for those of us who are feeling discouraged by this conversation, let's not forget XYZ. That was a huge win, right? So you can sort of add in that perspective afterwards. Depending on your relationship as a leader and how you're situated, you might also bring yourself into it. But that there's a big it depends, which is my lawyer training coming out. I'm feeling Like, as I listen to this conversation, I'm feeling like, wow, there's so much that we need to change. And that can be heavy and frustrating. I also don't want us to forget XYZ, right? So you're either owning it or you're making the observation of I imagine that this conversation could be having this effect, demotivating, discouraging, etc., and then supplementing the conversation. So again, we're having a more realistic perspective of the situation rather than letting one voice, all that negativity, dominate. Because not talking about the negative stuff doesn't mean it's not there. It's just going to subtly undermine you. And that those thoughts exist in a broader context that can be hard to remember when people go down that path. So let's bring that complexity and honesty back into the picture.
I love that. Um, Thank you so much, Mo, for that question, and Elaine, that thoughtful answer. And I'm just gonna ping in because back, 20 years ago, when the internet was just kind of becoming popular in social media, I ran this huge campaign for one of my clients. And one of the things we really focused was on the comment sections. And what we noticed was that when you started having negative kind of comments, it would just kind of spiral. So you actually needed really active community managers to shift and change the conversation. So it's so even not just virtual, like in person, but virtual meetings as well, or comments and all this other stuff can you can easily spiral to the negative, right? What you focus on, you get more of. So it's important to kind of have like different kind of viewpoints and be able to kind of redirect. I think one of the purpose as of a moderator is to have the diverse kind of voices speaking, opposed to the ones that might be like negative and loud, right? I want to read, we're kind of running out of time right now, but Donna says, I have found it helpful to ask the quiet team members to present on a topic or solution, ideas, etc., along with coaching along the way. And Blue Maris says, in Africa, we shout and fight to be heard. The loudest voice gets heard. So how to stop fighting and be heard? Okay, I love that. Blue Maris, well, why don't we just answer that? So how do we, when the loudest voice in the room gets usually heard, how do we, the ones with maybe quieter voice, how do we advocate for ourselves and be heard even in these situations and climates?
I'd go back to this idea of design. How are we, because if we don't design, we default to how we interact. And the default here is fight. And there's so much that we need to fight for. There's so much that we show up and fight for to change. And one completely underutilized tool is negotiating process. Rather than the what, talking about the how. How are we going to work together? How are we going to have this conversation? How are we going to determine priorities and resources this quarter, this month, this year, rather than jumping straight into the what? So the opportunity is to actually have the negotiation about the how and the process and the values and the decision-making criteria rather than the what, so that you don't have to do the hard pivot in the middle because you've already designed a process like asking complementary questions or standard questions that gets you to a more productive outcome.
Love that. Okay, so we are closing up. What's the one thing, Elaine, that you want everyone on this call to take away from this conversation?
You matter. You matter as you are. You are enough as you are. Yes, there are things that we can unlearn about the silence that we've learned and internalized, but having been silenced isn't because you're fundamentally flawed or lacking of worth or that you're not enough. We each are enough as human beings and deserving of dignity and belonging and of justice. So let's not forget that as we continue to unlearn our own silence and unlearn the ways that we unintentionally or intentionally silence the people around us.
I love that. Everyone, you know the deal. Turn on, if you're in the live Zoom audience, put this in gallery mode turn on your videos if you can. This is the only one time where I'm like, turn on your videos and unmute yourself. Make sure you buy Elaine's book, pre-order it today. Once you get it, give an honest review and make sure you comment, because that's how we hug our authors. Turn on your cameras, unmute yourself, and Elaine deserves a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Elaine! Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you,
Thank
everyone,
you.
for joining
you.
us. We really appreciate having you guys all here. And this is going to be on our Community of Seven YouTube channel, so you can watch this over again, because I know I need to take notes and you know, get all of the goodness from this call. But once again, thank you everyone for making this. See you during the next call. Okay.
Everybody.
Be